Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on the power of blocks. Hopefully, if you are joining me, it's because you would like to learn everything you need to know about blocks and component blocks inside of CET. My name is Anna Creek, coming to you from HNI Workplace Furnishing and the HAN extension. I am part of the design integration team, which handles the HAN extension in CET, as well as lots of other design and training opportunities. So things inside of CET that help designers work more efficiently is one of the things I am very passionate about, and that most definitely includes blocks. So I am very excited to bring some of that information to you here today, and I'm going to go ahead and step directly inside of CET so we can go ahead and get started. So what I want to do today when we talk about the power of blocks and what it can do for you inside of CET is I want to start down at a basic level by understanding exactly what it is that powers blocks. So the first conversation we're going to have today is about selection. And when you talk about selection in CET, as it says here on the screen, it is all about the colors. So what do we mean when we say it is all about the colors? What we mean is that when we make a selection inside of CET, the color that outlines our product determines not only what type of selection we have around our product, but also very much how that product is going to respond. So if you're familiar with CET, you know that the most common types of selection in CET are the single select and the group select, both of which can be toggled up here on the selection tool or by pressing the S key on your keyboard. So here we've got some seating arrangements here that are mapped out in identical to our selection colors. And we can see that if we turn to our single select, when we go to select a model in our CET, it's going to be a purple outline. So this is for selecting one item, whether it's grouped or snapped or not. So this is going to be that control S that's going to turn to our single select, toggle between single and group select. But here you can see that regardless of whether my product is snapped or grouped together, I can go ahead and select each item individually, and I have this purple outline around my product. Toggling that same tool brings us to our group select. So this is going to be a gold outline, and it means that items that are grouped or snapped together because they are PGC items are going to be all outlined and grouped together inside of this gold outline. So you can see here, because I have these chairs snapped onto this table with my HAN product, I'm going to select everything at once when I go ahead and select with my group select. So no matter what item I click on in here, I'm going to have that gold outline for my group select. This other item here, so our next one is the blue outline. So what this means is that we have taken some items that are not snapped together. So you can see these items in CET are spaced a little bit farther apart. They're not snapped together. However, if I right click on these items and I hit make group, then we can see that with our group select, these items are now outlined in blue. So this is a way that if your items aren't snapped together with your group select slapped together with a PGC function, you can still group a bunch of individual items together by right-clicking and hitting group. And then in that case, you can see that our group select selects these items together, even if they're not snapped together due to their PGC nature. So the difference here with our group select, we're using the exact same group select mode, but we have our gold outline versus our blue outline to determine whether these items are snapped together or not snapped together. If we move one of the items with our single select out of this group, when we go back to our group select, you can see that that item is no longer part of our group. So it's one way to keep our items connected and identify what kind of grouping is happening here with this blue outline. Last but not least, we have the topic that we are all here to discuss, and that is blocked product. So you can see here, I can go ahead and select my block with either my single select or my group select. And when I select it, everything in this arrangement is coming up as an outline, no matter whether I use my single or my group select. And the reason for that is because this product has been made into a block. So you can see the difference here between selecting all of my items with a group select, where I can still move individual items in and out of my selection, versus a block select, where now when I move all of my items in drawing space, they are going to remain locked together inside of this block. The other difference you'll see when we're talking about colors is that our blocked product is going to have an edit mode, and that is going to be periwinkle in color. So when we right click and make items a block, I'll go ahead and back up here so we can see these items become a block. So if I've got all these items together, regardless of whether they're snapped or not, I can right click and click Create Block, which is our Control B shortcut here. You'll see that it's going to pop up my block dialog, and here we've got our general CET naming with the component number and the time. I'm going to want to turn this into something else here. So I'm going to want to say this is 4 chairs plus table, some kind of name that's going to help me determine what this is at a later time. So when we have this in a block, you can see it's going to have this double outline, and it's always going to be blocked together like this in our drawing space. But if we double click into the block, that's where we go into our edit mode. So this is where we talk about that periwinkle blue, periwinkle purple color in our edit mode background. And this is where we can actually make changes to our product. So if we're going to be eliminating 2 of the chairs, for example, we can do that inside of edit mode on the block. And then when we come back to our block has changed, but the product that is there is still snapped together. So we still have that same outline no matter whether we're going with the single select or the group select, but we have this double outline box, one pink and one the other color of our selection, around all of our products. So the question here for this section is, are blocks superior to groups? And the answer is, while they're not necessarily superior, they both serve very different functions. So this group here would be excellent for if you had multiple product and you're just wanting to make sure that they stay ganged together. Maybe you're not expecting to work with them too much, but you want to make sure that you can very easily copy them or rotate them, but you don't anticipate needing to make a lot of universal changes. The wonderful thing about blocks is not only is it a firmer locking together, so you don't have to worry as much about items getting dragged apart from your general group selection, but as you'll see here in just a few moments, making things into blocks makes them editable across all of your drawings. So when we say are blocks superior to groups, the answer is not necessarily superior, but they definitely, in my opinion, blocks are going to serve a wider function across your drawing, as well as giving you a little bit of an easier access and some more benefits than simply grouping your items together. So pay attention when you are actually making selections inside of CET. It's important to pay attention to what color is happening when you highlight your product. As we can see from that brief demonstration, that is going to be what determines the functions when you go to copy or make changes in your drawing. It's going to depend on what color you're working with in your selection. So let's say we do have a block created, whether that's going to be just a simple table and 2 chairs, or maybe we have a block that's quite a bit larger. So you can see here in this case, we've made a block out of not only a pack of 4 workstations, but also some ancillary areas as well. So we have a little bit of a seating, maybe collaborative space over here. You can see we've thrown in a couple of accessories from some of our wonderful Configura marketplace extensions. Whatever it is that we want to kind of have some control over inside of our drawing, we're going to go ahead and make this space a block. So what benefits have we assumed now that we've made a block out of these particular items? There's actually quite a few benefits when it comes to creating blocks. The first one is that you're allowing for a much faster workflow, and that kind of follows that work smarter, not harder function. So, for those of you who are familiar with creating large drawings in CET, you know that a lot of times the more complex the product is, or the more expansive product you have, it can slow down your works or your drawing a little bit because you're working with lots of details and CET has lots of things to keep track of. So one of the reasons that blocks are so helpful is that instead of coming in and trying to use a selection tool like your rectangle select or your lasso select to try to creep in amongst all the product and select the items, your selection becomes much, much simpler by just selecting the whole block of product. So this means that functions like selecting, copying, tagging, and rotating are so much faster. So if I go to rotate this, for example, we can see that I'm only dealing with one rotation icon rather than trying to make sure that I have everything selected and possibly leaving something behind. Same for copying. So if I were to hit my A key here and copy this over to another set of stations here, we can see that the copying was much faster and much easier because I only had to make a one-click selection, and I can be confident that everything inside that block is going to be copied over, rather than when I try to make a selection by drawing around certain product, there's a chance that I might accidentally leave something behind. Other functions are a lot faster as well. So if we come into part tagging, for example, and let's say we wanted to apply two different tags to these areas, we'll just use the default room 1 and room 2 here. The nice thing here again is that we don't have to make a selection or try to drag a box around a very specific set of product in order to apply a tag. All we have to do is have our block selected, choose our tag, and then go ahead and click apply to selection. And everything inside of that block is officially tagged with that product. So sometimes we know that it's hard to select by using a lasso tool or by using maybe a custom shaped tagged area because not all of our product lines up at perfect 90-degree angles. And if we're wanting to tag product that's, has other product from a different tagged area very close to it, it can be very hard to go through and try to be precise in the drawing. So this not only allows you to be more precise with your tagging, your selecting, and your copying, but it also allows you to be much faster because you're doing just a simple click instead of trying to create your own boundary areas. The second point here is one that we can all relate to, and that is reducing spec errors. So, one of the things that all designers fear is the chance of a spec error happening, whether that is something left behind in the drawing, something that got failed to copy over or didn't snap properly. So, one of the things that blocks can provide us is the assurance that when we're doing those functions like selecting, copying, rotating, etc., that we're not leaving any product behind. So I'm going to go ahead and explode this second block so we can see some of the differences here. So if I go to copy these out, let's say that I go to make several stations like this, we can see that when I copy this block over, I can be very assured that everything that was blocked together here has copied over. Whereas if I need to come in here and make a selection, we can see already I might have to remove this block from my selection. I don't necessarily want that to go. If we, are just a little bit off with our selection block, you might see things left behind, especially if we're in that single select mode. So if some of my product is not snapped together and I go to wrap around here, usually going in a counterclockwise direction will help me snap. But if I go in a clockwise direction, we can see that not everything in my selection might get selected. So I might leave a couple of chairs behind. And then when I go to copy things over, we can see that I'm missing some of the items in there. And if those were big items, it may be very easy for you to catch. But if it's smaller items, or if it causes something to snap incorrectly in your product, you may be left with an unintentional spec error that you didn't notice in the grand scheme of a large drawing. So having that reassurance that we have gone ahead and made sure everything is functioning exactly the same because everything is locked together in the exact same way really helps us reduce spec errors. The other reason that we're reducing a lot of spec errors here is because when you go to make changes to some of your product, you are actually having to take less steps to copy everything, to copy those changes over. So if I go inside this edited block that I created and my customer says, these chairs are great here, but I would really like to take them to a more natural wood color. So we go ahead and we apply that natural wood color. Every single block that we've copied out in that drawing now has that change applied. Whereas blocks or product that we copied out and exploded the block are no longer part of that linked system. So we can see here, of these 3 areas that we copied out, 2 of them that are still the copied block have the universal changes made to them, which means that we don't have to go back for every single instance here and change everything. In this area that's not created with a block, we would have to go back and change all of these chairs in whatever areas of the building they're in, and that could lead to maybe an area being forgotten, or possibly, again, just missing something in there that is not seen in the grand scheme of a drawing, so we would have to go back and correct that. The third point here is creating easier favorites and typicals. So this is quite similar to the point that we said first, allowing for the faster workflow. Because we have that larger selection, we can very easily go ahead and right click on this and click Save as Favorite. So I am firmly of the belief that if you create something inside of CET, you should always be saving it as a favorite. So we can say that this is an example collab and station space. Save that as a favorite. And again, we don't have to draw around all of the product. We don't have to take time selecting those items. And now when we go ahead and we bring that in from a favorite, so if we go ahead and click on Insert Favorite and we grab that favorite we just made, again, it's going to load faster, it's going to be easier to drop, and it's going to be easier to move and manipulate inside of our drawing once we do drop it, because we have just that single click that encompasses all of our product. So any function that you're going to be creating that does involve all of those functions for selecting and copying and rotating is going to be made easier with blocks. And then last but not least is, of course, the point that we just made about changing the finishes. We're allowing for mass changes across entire spaces. So this makes this perfect for large drawings. If you've got 100 workstations in your drawing and all your user wants to do is change the chair cushion fabric, we can just come in here and make one click to make that a different color. So if they're saying, this is just a little bit too bland for our taste, maybe we're looking for something with a little bit more of a color to it. So we come down here and we make a choice in our selections here. We hit apply to cover all of those chairs inside of our block. Again, you can see we're here inside of block edit mode because we do have this periwinkle background here. But then we go back out to our drawing, and again, all of the blocks are changed. So this is a great way to be efficient when you're making changes. And again, you're making sure that you're covering every workstation. Now, I will make a little caveat here when allowing for mass changes, is you want to make sure that when you're copying blocks out, that you do in fact want all those blocks to be tied to the same changes. So because these blocks were copied out from one another, any change I make to this first block, I make to this second block as well. So this is great for if I want to make all of those changes across the entire drawing board, but if this station, for example, decides to break apart and have different finishes than this first station, then rather than going through and trying to, explode these blocks and then remake the blocks, all I have to do is tell them that I would like to clone this second block. So what does it mean when I go ahead and I clone a block? That means that I have taken this original block and I've made an exact copy of it that is now its own individual block. So I'm going to say that this is the workspace second area. It's really important to name your blocks here. As you'll see as we start to get deeper and deeper into these blocks, it's really important to name all of these just to make sure that you don't end up confusing with which blocks are which inside of your dialogue, because in a very large floor plan, you may end up with quite a few blocks, especially if you have to clone some of your areas. So by cloning this here, we can now step into our second block and say, it turns out that they would like these to be a little bit more of an orange color. So we come in here, we make these that orange color. And you can see because this block was cloned, it is no longer linked back to this original block. So our first area can be copied out with its, maroon chairs as many times as we need it to. Our second area can be copied out with its tangerine chairs as many times as we want to. But we can be determined that no matter what changes we make to either of these blocks, it will not affect the other anymore because this has become its own separate block. So there's a chance that inside of a whole pack of workstations, you may need to make several sets of blocks depending on exactly how many stations you plan on making universal changes to. So, section question. What if I didn't use blocks or component blocks from the beginning? So what if I have a whole area here and everything in my drawing is laid out, but I didn't know about the benefits of blocks and component blocks, so I didn't use it? Maybe everything in my drawing looks exactly like this, where everything is just laid out and everything is individual. So in that case, it may be worth the time to go back through and make some of your areas blocks, but you don't necessarily have to do that all at once. So if you have a drawing where you didn't use blocks or component blocks from the very beginning, then my suggestion to you is to go ahead and implement the tool slowly as you work through the drawing. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're going to go ahead and make some changes to these workstations. It might be beneficial to you to just go ahead and make a block out of only the workstations. So we can say that this is a 4-pack of stations. And in this case, it might be better for you to go ahead and take that 4-pack and replace the block with any other areas that have 4-packs. So it may take a little bit of work to get some of the blocks implemented in your drawing and copy them back out. But just doing small areas at a time means you don't have to go back through right away and decide exactly what areas need to be blocks and which ones don't. Some of these areas may not be moving or may not have a lot of changes coming, which means you don't necessarily have to go back and make all of those areas blocks at this current time. I would encourage you to just go ahead and work with the areas that you're making changes to at the time. And then further along, if you need to make changes to any other areas, you can go ahead and use the blocks that you've already created and go from there, where eventually, as you start to work your way through changes in the drawing, you'll have more and more blocks and the drawing will become more and more efficient. So there's lots of ways that you can implement these tools. I know sometimes if you don't use tools from the very beginning, it's hard to remember to implement them. So just remember that you can kind of take this as a step-by-step process through your drawings as well. So when we talk about blocks, we talk about getting all of our product blocked together. But what about the panels? Won't someone think of the panels? So what do we do when it comes to panel systems? Well, the answer is component blocks. So this section is component blocks to the rescue. So we're going to take the things that we just applied, all of the knowledge we just applied about making and cloning and copying blocks, and we're going to talk about it in the application of a panel system. So the way that component blocks differ from regular blocks, and you can see here in our example, I've gone ahead and put some actual panels in here so we can talk about the difference. Whereas over here we didn't have actual panels in our stations. Component blocks can only be used within actual panel applications. So that's why I went ahead and changed this all to panels. So the difference between blocks and component blocks is where blocks go ahead and take everything in your selection and turn it into a block. Component blocks essentially take the components of your workstation and separate them from the panel layouts. So the way that I've heard component blocks referred to by some people is I have some people that call them the interior components of the station, the guts of the workstation, if you will. Not my favorite term, but it's one I hear very often. So it essentially means that you've made a block, but only out of the components of your workstations. So why would this be something that can help us in CET, or why would this be something that we would want to use? There's a couple of reasons that we would want to use this. So the first one is that not every, as much as we wish that every single pack of stations in our design specifications was a perfect 4-pack or a perfect 6-pack, the reality is that that is not the case. So, sometimes you're going to have a 4-pack, and then the very next set of stations you might have could be a 6-pack. So let's go ahead and copy these panels out here and make this a 6-pack. So you know that sometimes you're going to have to flex in the number of stations in a pack. Sometimes you may have to eliminate a station to get around a column. There's lots of reasons why it wouldn't necessarily work to make every single station pack a block, because they're all going to be a different layout. So the reason that we love component blocks is because once we make component blocks, we can then take whatever station layouts we have, and for example, we could snap in all of our left-handed stations, get all of these snapped in, and then we can take our right-hand component block and snap in all of our right-handed stations. So it gives us an opportunity to quickly sort of autofill all of our panel layouts with station components. So what's the process for creating a component block? How is it different than creating a regular block? What I like to do when I'm starting with workstations, and I know that I'm going to want to use component blocks, is I'm going to want to create essentially a left-hand station and a right-hand station. So here we can see I'm going to go ahead and bring these in like we had created a left and a right-hand station. Flip that around here. Oops. Let me grab the right one here. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and explode these so that we can take a step back here. Grab this one and snap it in and explode it. So what I'm doing here is I'm just pretending like we created a left and a right hand station for both of these station layouts. So let me go ahead and explode that block. So here we go. We've got a left hand version of this station, and we've got a right hand version of this station. Eventually you may end up with more than just a left and a right, but for now we're just going to go ahead and focus on those two. So if we go ahead and we select everything in our station that we just created, and we right-click on the component or right-click on the components, we now not only get the option for creating a block, which if we did that would create a block of everything in this station, including the panels, but instead we can right-click and click Create Components Block. So you can see here it's going to highlight as a component block. So we're going to go ahead and call this the right hand station with poof. And we're going to do the same thing over here. We're going to highlight everything in here. We're going to right click, create component block, and we will call this the left hand station with poof. So what have we done here? We've essentially said, okay, here's our panel layout for a left-hand station, and here's all of the components that need to go inside that panel layout. Here's a panel layout for our right-hand station, and here is all of the components that go into it. So when we drag our components outside of our panel layout, and this is especially easy to see in 3D, you can see that it's going to keep all of our components locked in place exactly as they would be if they were still attached to the panels. So in this product application, we can see these little brackets that attach to the panels are going to remain here, even though technically this would not be a freestanding application. So we could never just go ahead and install this particular product setup without panels. What this is doing is locking all of the components together exactly how they're going to mount to the panels, so that when you snap them into that same panel layout, you can be rest assured that everything you need is correct with all of your brackets. Everything you need to connect is going to be the same and consistent throughout the stations. So when you drag your components away from your panel layout, you'll see sort of this ghost application of the panel layout that was created, and it will all highlight in red. So what you're looking for here is this is essentially saying, hey, this product that you placed was built upon the contingency of having this particular and exact panel surrounding it. So when we click into this component block, you can see that in edit mode on a component block, the background is this bubblegum pink color. And we're going to have what I like to call reference panels in that component block. So when you go into edit mode, it'll show you the panels that this component block was built upon, but these panels aren't actually real. They're not actually included in your bill of materials. They're only here as an edit mode replication for how your components behave to the panel systems. So here we can see that we have a 30-inch panel with the work surface coming off of it, and both the leg and the brackets for the work surface are tying into the panels, which means these components inside of that component block require that panel layout in order for this component product to be accurate. It's locking all of this together, but that doesn't mean that we can, just leave this outstanding in the cold. We still need that 30-inch panel. So until I snap that component block into a layout that matches the layout that we have inside of the component block's editing space, these panels will remain red. So let's say, for example, I deleted this panel and I snapped this component block in. It's going to say, hey, all of these panels match up with the reference that you created these components with, but your component block is showing a panel on the back here, and currently there's no panel in this back area that you snapped together. So in this case, this component block would work perfectly to snap into this panel layout, but it is going to warn us that we're missing a reference panel, because when we click into this component block, technically it wants to see this panel here, even though in this application it's not technically a structural component of holding up these work surfaces. It's still trying to prevent you from making an error by leaving a panel out anywhere. So we're going to go ahead and add this panel back in. Oops, I want to copy just the panel. I'm going to go ahead and add that panel back in, re-snap our component block, and then you can see we have no more red lines. So when you're going ahead and you're snapping a component block in, you'll see that the yellow panel is going to be like where your component block tries to snap. You can actually toggle that reference panel by holding down the space key. So I can go ahead and see like which panel I want to snap to by holding down that space key. And then I can snap on either side of that panel. So if you have layouts that are the same back to back, you would be able to go ahead and snap those across the panel. But since these have a left and a right application, I want to make sure that I'm snapping it on the correct side of the panel. So as long as the panels that are inside of your component block editing mode match the panels that are here outside in your drawing space that the block is snapped into, you won't see any red panels. But if you do see those red panels, that is a good indication that there's something mismatched inside and outside of your component block, and you need to address that to make sure that it doesn't affect the actual structural supports that your component block contains. Now, what happens if we go ahead and we have a difference in height? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stretch these panels down a little bit. Make sure we get our blocks all the way up there. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and snap these component blocks back in here. Now we can see we have a yellow highlighted panel rather than a red highlighted panel. Yellow in CET typically means a little less severe than red, but it's still something we want to address here. And what's happening is that CET is saying, okay, yep, it's true. You have the correct component block in here. So like everything in the panel layout is correct. But inside of your component block, when you created this, you told CET that the panel in the front here was a 50 high panel. Well, in your drawing, the panel in the front of this snapped component block is only 42 inches. So yellow panels are indicating a difference in height between what's inside your component block as a reference and what's outside in your drawing space. So red is definitely going to be your most severe. That's something you need to address with your layout. But if you see any yellow highlighted panels with your component block snapped in, that just means you need to address something about the change in height. So we want to make sure that nothing is coming in at the wrong height or that something wasn't accidentally stretched where it wasn't supposed to be. So let's say in that example where we took our component block panel off here, we took this little wing panel off the back. We snapped a component block in and now it's saying, hey, oh, there's a panel missing here. We need to address that. We could come in here to our reference and we could say, I don't want this panel in here. But if we do that, we have to remember that every single panel, every single left-hand station has that panel in the back. So if this is the only station that doesn't, then we want to go back in and we want to make sure that most of our blocks or our component blocks contain that panel. If it's only going to be this station in the back that does it, that's where we're going to want to go back to our cloned block and we're going to want to say in our block dialog that this is the left-hand station, no back wing panel. Whatever you need to edit to make sure that you're keeping track of your clones. A lot of times I like to name my component blocks for what has changed. So in that case, this is going to be the station that doesn't have a wing back panel. So now I can clone my block and all the other left-hand stations have this wing panel back here as a reference. This is the only one that does not. So now if I go to click on my left-hand stations and I change my little poof color to green, for example, it's going to change all of my left-hand component stations, but it's not going to change this left-hand cloned station. So that's one thing you have to remember about cloning your blocks and component blocks is that this cloned product will no longer tie into the changes made on the standard block. So I would have to come back in here and edit this one separately to make sure that I'm getting all of the same colors in here. That's also a reminder that just because I edited my left-hand station block does not mean that my right-hand station block has changed. So when you're dealing with component blocks and you're making a change to like a seating color, for example, you have to make sure that you're editing all of the variations of the workstation, including the left-hand blocks, the right-hand blocks, and any cloned variations that you went ahead and created. It's still going to be a lot faster, even if we have to deal with a left and a right station and multiple clones. It's still going to be a lot faster than going back and trying to make edits to every single station or remembering to delete something out of every single workstation. So here you can see when we snapped this clone block back in, we can go ahead and remove that panel, tell it the clone block doesn't need it, and now we no longer have that red panel in our drawing. Same with these two front stations. So let's say these two front stations were going to act as maybe a receptionist area. So maybe they're supposed to have these super low panels. But in all of our blocks here, we told CET that it's built with 50 high panels. So we're going to see these yellow highlighted panels coming up. So in that case, I might want to go ahead and clone both of these. I'm going to go ahead and clone this right-hand station, and I'm going to say that this is the right-hand station reception, and that this is cloned, and this is the left-hand station reception. So now that these two blocks have been cloned, I can go into their reference panels and I can lower the reference panels in front of the stations. So I'll do that for both the left and the right hand reference panels. And now you can see that we do not have any other yellow lines because these component blocks were now created in their reference edit mode, were now created with those 35 high panels. However, all of the other stations still maintain that 50 high panel on the front. So anytime you make a change to a component block or have it in a different setting than it was originally created with, you definitely want to keep an eye out for those red and those yellow panels, and make sure that if you're editing the panel layout that you edit it inside of the component block as well to make sure that all of those supports are still valid. So this is still going to allow us to make vast universal changes across multiple stations. And more importantly, it's going to reduce the amount of spec errors, because if my customer comes in and tells me to change these poofs to green, it's going to be a lot easier for me to change it on 4 stations than it is for me to necessarily change it across an entire drawing and risk missing a station or maybe even missing an entire area. So the second question here is, how can component blocks help me space plan? And this is a great question because component blocks are wonderful for space planning. If we go ahead and we grab our panel system out from our stations here, let's say we have just a room. It doesn't have to be necessarily anything spectacular. We could just come in here and grab a rectangle, any kind of room that our customer is wanting to fill with workstations. A lot of times you'll have a customer that says, I just need to know how many of these 6-packs can fit in the space. So you come in here and you start to play around with different layouts, single-sided, double-sided applications. Maybe you come in and you remove a station or two and you do everything you can to space plan and fit as many stations in here as possible. It's a lot easier to manipulate the panel layouts without any components in it than it is to actually go ahead and edit these stations when they're full of components. So component blocks will help you space plan because you can go ahead and plan with panels only. And then when you're done planning with your panels, you can just come in here and you can fill the stations with all of your component blocks. So it'd be really easy to just kind of create the layout with the panels first and then go back in and populate it with all of your components. So that can be an excellent tool for those of you who are used to space planning. So when we talk about our next section, the Clone Wars, that's where we're talking more about those red and yellow panels, and we want to make sure that we're accurately keeping track of our clones. So every time you go ahead and clone a particular block, you can see it's going to go ahead and create a brand new list block here inside of your block dialog, which, as you can see, I've been accessing through our little quick properties button here. But you can see that every time you do this, it's going to make a clone 1 or a clone 2. If I go to copy this out and I create another clone with my block dialog, you can see that it's just going to go clone 1 and clone 2. So what we're trying to avoid here is to avoid having an army of clones inside of our drawing, because at this point it's going to be really hard in my drawing for me to tell what's clone 1 versus clone 2, and I'm not going to remember that clone 1 has no wing panel or that clone 2 has a lower front panel. So I want to make sure that I'm labeling all of my clones exactly as I've been doing in our previous demonstrations, where I put a little description in, like no back wing panel or reception desk or lower panels, whatever it is that I need to remember about these. And then as I'm cloning, it's just really, really important to go ahead and keep these red and yellow panels in mind to make sure that you're addressing any changes between what you're seeing in your reference panels here versus what you're seeing in your actual drawing space cloned block. So when we come to the question, why is a good naming structure so important? That's where we get into that Clone Wars discussion. So we do not want to have a list of clones in our workstations. We want to make sure that we can identify exactly why each of these stations were cloned and what the purpose for cloning them is. Last but not least, Blockception DiCaprio style. So hopefully everyone gets the reference to the movie Inception, where it's about, a dream world inside of a dream world, and we don't know what's real and what's not. So what happens when we start to combine blocks and component blocks? The answer is we just continue to be super efficient inside of our drawing space. So here, if we've got a section of component blocks, so here you can see we've got just our regular block. I'm going to go ahead and copy this panel system with our component blocks over. And then I'm going to take this pack of component blocks and I'm going to go ahead and make a block out of my pack of component blocks. So what we've done here is I'm going to say that this is a 6-pack of stations. What we've done here is we've made a block with 6 component blocks on the inside. So now we've combined all of the benefits of blocks with our component blocks. So we can give all of our similar blocks their own style, and we can make sure that not only when we're copying are we picking up all of our component blocks, so we've got all of the benefits we just talked about with our component blocks, but now we've locked our blocks in place as well. So what happens when I have a component blocks inside of a block? Like, how do I know how far in to edit it? Well, all we have to do is click on this block and step inside our regular block, which you can see is our periwinkle blue background. And then I have component blocks inside of there. So I can click in once to go into my block editing space. I can click in twice to go into my component block space. So that's why, again, going back to what we talked about in the beginning, it is all about the colors. So it is recognizing what your background edit color is, so you know exactly where you're editing, whether it's inside a block or a component block. But now all of the benefits of our component blocks are locked together with all the benefits of our block. And as we go to copy this station pack out throughout our floor plan, we can be confident that every single copy here has all of the benefits of a block. So now if I come in here to this block, click into this component block, and my customer says, I know we keep changing this, but I really need the poofs to be red now. So we step back out into our blocks, and now we can see that every single left-hand station now has a red block. So we're making great universal changes, and in all of our functions in our drawing, we're sure that we're getting everything copied over and ready to go. So one of the biggest questions I get asked when we talk about this blockception, blocks inside of blocks and component blocks inside of blocks, is how do I keep track of part tags? So sometimes, you have a customer that might want to tag their seating separately from the rest of their workstations. And when you have a block like this, where your blocks and your component blocks and everything is locked together, you may be wondering how you separate those chairs from the rest of your components, because we talked about earlier how it's a lot easier to part tag when you can just go ahead and select a block. What you can do here is, let's say that all of these stations are going to be in a room 1 tag except for our seating. So what we can do in our part tag is we can go ahead and apply, I'm going to go back out to the drawing here, and I'm going to apply the room 1 tag to our entire blocked area. And then I'm going to step inside our right-hand block, and I'm going to apply a tag called seating. I'll go ahead and give it another color so we can really pop out and see it here. I'm going to select the seating in my component block, which is where I can select my items individually, and I'm going to apply that selection to those options. So now, if I go back out to my drawing, all of my right-hand blocks, the seating is tagged. So now I'll come into the other side here, and I'll do the same thing. I'll select these with my individual select tool. We can see that purple outline, and I'll go ahead and apply those to my seating. And now when we bring up our calculations with our lasso calculations tool, we can see that our tagged areas are going to be room 1, room 1 for everything except for our seating. So you can see here all of our seating has been tagged in our separate tagged area. So that's one thing you can do. You can assign a tag to the block for kind of what the vast majority of the product is going to be. And then you can go ahead and go into the block or step into the component block and apply single tags to individual product, which will override the actual block tag. So it does require you to be a little bit more finessed in the way that you apply some of your tags, but just because everything is locked into a block does not mean that it necessarily all has to be tagged the same. So whether you are a beginner CET level user or an intermediate or advanced level CET user, everyone can benefit from blocks. And it's just about knowing the what the color selections mean and making sure that you're keeping track of all of your blocks and component blocks with a naming system and watching out for any errors that the system is trying to show you. So hopefully this gives you a chance to step into some of your drawings, try out blocks and component blocks for yourself, and become much more efficient in all of your specifications. I want to thank everyone so much for joining me today. If you have any questions, definitely reach out to the Configura Help Center, reference back to this video, or reach out to your manufacturer with specific product questions. I hope you all had a wonderful conference or enjoyed the recordings if you have access to the Configura recordings. Thank you everyone for being here, and I will hopefully talk to you soon.